Welcome, welcome, welcome to Wealth Strategies Unleashed with Concenture Wealth Management. I'm Robert Gilliland, and as a follow-up to a past podcast, we're very, very, very fortunate to have Dr. Gina Pritchard with us with the Prevent Clinic. Dr. Gina is a doctor who goes through and helps really, from my perspective, and getting to know her, treats the whole person. But the focus is all around the heart. And so, Dr. Pritchard, thank you very much for joining us here. Do me a favor, to let all of our listeners who maybe didn't necessarily catch the last time, give us a little bit of background kind of about you.
So I spent 35 plus years in the coronary critical care unit of the hospital and saw thousands of patients come in with heart attack, congestive heart failure, stroke, primarily. And we were thrilled when coronary stents, I don't know, probably a lot of your listeners are familiar with that, either from a loved one or hearing about heart stents. We were thrilled when that came out because we thought this is going to knock heart attack off the #1 killer spot. And now we know we didn't even appreciate how much and how well to use stents at the time. Now we have stenting for the carotid arteries to help with brain blood supply, kidneys to help with kidney blood supply, lower extremities. But it hasn't dropped the heart attack rate, not one bit. It hasn't dropped the stroke rate, because what we realize now, and that was, again, my life for 35 plus years, is that we're treating 1 inch of a blood vessel system that's 60,000 miles of blood vessels in our body. There's some that are smaller than a hair, little, all throughout the body, and every one of them important. And so it was so just reductionistic, but it saves your life. You're having chest pain, you're having symptoms, a stent or perhaps bypass surgery and the right meds is what you need in a crisis. After that, you need to quickly get to a prevention specialist to work on those other miles and miles of blood vessels, which is what I do today. It led me, a series of events in the hospital led me to seek out more, me and a couple of the cardiologists, to say, what else can we do? It begins to feel like an assembly line after a while, because people would keep coming back.
Right.
Well, if we know they have a problem, shouldn't we be seeing their adult children who now have a family history? And what else can we do for this patient sitting in front of us to keep them from coming back again? And so that's led to ultimately opening a practice with a group of cardiologists, and now my own practice and multi-state practice and telehealth practice, to try to get this message to more people that you can do so much to keep from having your first heart attack, and if you've had one, to keep from having another one. And as you and I were talking earlier, this same issue affects so many other things. Your brain, dementia, stroke, kidneys for kidney failure, diabetes is involved. So all of these things we're testing for and recommending will protect you from many, many other diseases as well.
So, it's amazing in hearing that is that, even in COVID, during the pandemic, the #1 killer of Americans was heart attack. It is maintained. It's still the #1 killer. But I'm not exactly certain where diabetes comes in, but that's a big, big, big deal. Insulin inside of there. And you kind of talked about this on the last podcast about glucose and insulin, and you get these big spikes, and you drink that Coke and all of a sudden everything's spiked up. Mm-hmm. How does my heart, and talk about the interconnectivity, if you will, of these other diseases that maybe we're not calling it cardiovascular. It's these other diseases. And you mentioned some of them. Obviously, we understand stroke, what that is and what kind of happened. I think maybe we do. But diabetes, dementia, how does the heart, it seems to me like the heart is that's what we got to make sure we're paying the most attention to, and making sure we're taking care of these other things. But I don't know if my questions make any sense, to be quite honest, but let's talk about diabetes and what that has to do with heart health.
Yes. Such a great question and such a great point, because I'll preface it by saying inflammation and something called oxidation, which is like rusting of the pipes, just like you can get an oxidized pipe, but pipe gets rusty. That can happen on the inside of the body. It's a similar process. So inflammation and oxidation drives every one of these diseases we've talked about. Simply put, it's your immune system trying to save you, but it can't keep up. So the immune system, I'll just leave that there. All of that is involved in diabetes, and diabetes, it drives all of that. It's sort of this vicious cycle, because remember we talked about last time that diabetes is a continuum. So when you're born, insulin and glucose play beautifully together, if you will. They communicate with each other well. They're both hormones. Insulin is also, we've heard a lot of talk about peptides. Insulin is actually a peptide hormone. But anyway, they regulate what's going on inside the body. One of the major things that's going on inside of the body, insulin and glucose does. The cells need a perfect amount of insulin and glucose within a certain range. So, worst case scenario, a person gets up, drives to the convenience store and has a Danish and a Coca-Cola for the morning, or a Danish and a coffee full of sugar. And then drives through Starbucks and has the same thing. And then at mid-morning snack, they have a candy bar. And then at lunch, they have a sandwich that's got a lot of bread on it and who knows what else. If they just eat the meat and cheese out of it, they'd be better off, because that's real food. And maybe they have potato chips on the side. Think of the carb all day long throughout the day. And then maybe they have something like that ice cream before they go to bed. And the body cannot withstand that over years and years. And meaning you just get dysregulation of insulin and glucose communication. So you move further towards diabetes and further away from a healthy insulin and glucose communication. And we can determine where everybody is on that pathway, if you will. And that's why diabetes, or even insulin resistance, an earlier stage, if you will, of diabetes, in the level of 80 to 90% of people that come into the hospital, they have with a heart attack or a stroke or kidney failure. They have diabetes and they don't know it. We've had people even say, somehow when I was in the hospital, I caught diabetes, like it's a contagious disease. No, you had it before you came in here, but you just didn't know it because it's not tested for. When people get a fasting blood sugar on their annual blood work every year, that is the last thing to show you that you have diabetes, or that you're even knocking on the door of diabetes. The last thing. There's so much better blood work to help us understand where you are. So diabetes, because your immune system can't regulate all of that. You just get damage of the cells on so many levels that diabetes does put you at risk for all of what you mentioned: dementia, Alzheimer's, kidney failure, heart disease, heart attack, stroke, liver failure. You've heard of people having to have stents or interventions to restore blood flow to the feet.
Right.
That can be diabetes, and it can be vascular disease from diabetes. It's all interconnected because of this, at its core, inflammation and oxidation.
I saw some statistics and kind of preparing for this. We've got, 300 million people in the United States, and 97.6 million of them are pre-diabetic. That's a third, for all intents and purposes, right? What exactly
Right.
does pre-diabetic mean? Because
Yeah.
my guess is that means that every third person is pre-diabetic. What does that
right.
mean?
Yeah, every third person is pre-diabetic. And what that means is, if we were to check all of the labs to tell us where does this person stand in terms of, do they have diabetes and they don't know it? Or are they getting really close to diabetes, that timeline I was talking about?
Right.
We would check their fasting insulin level. All experts agree your first goal is to get that under 10. And that's a far better marker of where someone is in terms of heading towards diabetes, if a fasting insulin level is above 10. And I see them in my practice as high as 40 and 50, a lot of times in the 30s. We want it under 10, first goal. And then we see, how could we get it under 3 or 4? Again, under 6 is probably ideal, and I don't know that 3 or 4 is better. Debated at the expert level. Insulin level below 10, number 1. Otherwise, you don't have pristine insulin and glucose metabolism. You are pre-diabetic. We just don't know how pre you are. We don't know if you've got 30 years to get diabetes or if you're close. So then we need more data. We need to know liver enzymes, for example. If they're trending upward, then, and maybe you don't even drink alcohol at all, an individual that we're testing their liver enzymes. Liver enzymes can go up just because they're overloaded with the carbohydrate load. And it tells us that your liver is already at an early stage struggling to keep up with all of these pastries and Coca-Colas and sugars dripped in on a constant basis. Liver enzymes. Uric acid, you may have heard about that. That's a more difficult one to explain, but Dr. Perlmutter has written on that. Want that to be low, or it's indicative. Well, your listeners probably have heard of high uric acid and gout. That's really
Right.
a diabetic problem or a pre-diabetic problem. So
Really?
uric acid you want low. It is.
I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah. And then another thing you can do is look at your triglycerides and your good, quote, good. I don't really like calling that, but HDL, the high density lipoprotein, is the one classified as kind of a good cholesterol. You want your triglycerides to be low. The lab report will say under 150, but we know for perfect insulin and glucose metabolism, it needs to be under 100, probably under 90 on a regular basis, the fasting triglyceride. So if your fasting triglycerides are 149 and the lab says they're normal because they're not 150 yet, this person is pre-diabetic. There's no doubt about it. Even if their HDL is pretty good. But that ratio of triglycerides to HDL gives us a clue on how's the body doing at keeping up with the glucose and insulin load. So you want triglycerides under 100 and HDL as high as you can get it, above 40, if at all possible, above 50. And there may be a few other labs that I've mentioned, but insulin level below 10 is the place to start. And then triglycerides below 100.
That's where you focus. So the other thing is that you mentioned in our last podcast had to do with kind of dementia or cognitive decline, and we see that as you get older. But here, I don't think that as people get older, they work their whole life, they're engaged and they're involved, and they finally made it, and they decide to go ahead and retire. I don't think that just because you are 75 years old, you all of a sudden can no longer solve a crossword puzzle, right? It's that cognitive decline. And the last time we had this, in our last podcast, you kind of talked about how the heart affects that. Can you go a little bit more in depth and maybe even talk a little bit about kind of some things you can be doing right now without regard to your age to help minimize or reduce the risk of cognitive decline as you get older?
Yes, absolutely, I can. All that we just talked about with prediabetes and insulin resistance and diabetes is one of the key contributors to dementia and Alzheimer's and vascular related dementia, all of the dementias. So the things you can do are to, and this will be, I'll sound like a broken record, but is to get out and move your body, take a nice brisk walk for 20 minutes and build some muscle. As we said in the previous podcast, we have to have plenty of protein to build muscle. That's key. But what happens with the heart is, the heart and brain interplay is all of this difficulty regulating blood flow. You remember how I said earlier, the brain is a diva? So the brain is going to take what the brain needs because the brain knows it's regulating everything, and to keep you alive, the brain has to work. And so we talk about cardiopulmonary, heart and lung, and cardiopulmonary neurocommunication. All of those three things are critically important. So if the heart isn't getting adequate blood supply, it's not at the tiny capillary, little blood vessel level. There's a problem even getting the blood flow to the brain. And then once it gets to the brain, no other organ has as what's the word I'm looking for? Like tremendous amount of the tiniest blood vessels that we have in our body as the brain. Every cell in there needs a lot of oxygen and a lot of nutrients to do all of the things we need our brain for. And so any small amount of insulin resistance, like we were just talking about, leads to minor decreases in oxygen and blood flow to a little area of the brain. You don't even know it's happening at first. But once that goes on for 20 years or 30 years or 40 years, cells begin to die in the brain. And at first, it may be that you just, like I've had patients come to see me and say, I was having trouble remembering names and I was having trouble recalling a word. And I just laughed, we all lose our keys. And that's all true. Part of it is just because we're all multitasking, we're all busy,
Right.
and it is. But then they will call me because they'll say, I actually was pumping gas at the gas station and I could not tell you how to get to my home. I had to call my wife and say, tell me, do I turn right or turn left? Then you know it's become a problem. So if you're noticing any problem like that, you definitely need an evaluation. I had one patient that could find their way home, but once they got on the street, they couldn't remember which house was theirs. So they would use the garage door opener and just go down the street till the garage opened.
That would
So
be
if you're
absolutely
noticing,
terrifying. That would
it's
be
terrifying.
terrifying.
If you're noticing anything at that level and afraid to say something, we can still improve it now. But what's been happening for years is what we just talked about. This insulin and glucose communication that gets out of whack is at first the body does everything possible to reverse that and to improve your health. But if you're starting to notice signs that either that or one of those other categories we talked about has been going on too long. And so imagine that the insulin and glucose problem is causing little tiny blood vessels to affect parts of your brain over years and years. And then the heart also is being affected from the same blood vessel problem. It's not getting what it needs because the brain's stealing everything and because there's barely enough to go around because of this problem. Then the heart's not pumping to the brain as well as it used to. So it just really sets up this vicious cycle. To try to put it simply, that's how the heart and the brain and really every other organ is connected, because it's just a slow, steady decrease in the nutrients and the oxygen getting where they need to be.
You know, it is so incredible. And as I've gotten to know you and then read the different books, and you kind of start to dig into this, it is, the body really is made. There's no other machine that is made like the human body. This thing does it because of this, and the reason why it does that is to help this, right? And all these things that are interconnected. You go through and you think about the thing to me that is so amazing is that your cardiovascular health has such a huge impact on your neurological health, which you, in order to do that, you have to feed the machine the right type of fuel. And everything we have has sugar added to it, right? And where that is, the thing that's interesting, you think about continuous glucose monitoring. There used to be a thing that if you saw someone that were sticking their finger because you knew that, or you automatically assumed that they were a diabetic, and you actually, I would have sympathy for them, right? Wondering, making sure they're okay and not gonna, and that's not necessarily the case. It probably does make sense to think about how all these things all work together, and continuous glucose monitoring from time to time may make sense. Or how often should people do some of these different tests?
Yes. I'm so glad you brought that up, because one thing I meant to say earlier is, and it's tied into the continuous glucose monitor, is one of the best things we can all do is to do intermittent fasting. I know there's a lot about that out there on social media, but we're feeding ourselves these, even if you eat carbohydrates, if you eat them for 20 hours a day, 18 hours a day, 16 hours a day, it's just too much. So the narrower you can eat within reason, let's say if you can narrow your window of eating in a 24-hour period to be 14 hours, maybe 12 hours, maybe try a day where you only eat within an 8-hour window or a 4-hour window, and the rest of the time you have plenty of water and tea, black tea or something like that, or herb tea. Anyway, that's key for reversing all of what we're talking about on these two podcasts, for sure. A whole host of diseases. It's anti-aging, etc. So intermittent fasting is incredibly important. And what we're seeing with these continuous glucose monitors is how that can, what I say, help reset the clock, or reset
Right.
your longevity clock, because it improves the way that insulin and glucose communicate with each other, like we were talking about. If you're knocking on the door of the diabetes, step one, get rid of the carbs and do intermittent fasting. Move your body more. And if you're early stage, you can't get that insulin level like we talked about earlier. If you can't get it below 10, get rid of the carbs and do intermittent fasting. And we'll see with a continuous glucose monitor, or with a finger stick, which is a great tool too. People just get tired of sticking their finger, but it's just as good. you will see what I say flattening of the curve. You don't want to eat something and see your blood sugar go to 200 and then drop to 60. That tells us there's dysregulation. And even if it's a Coca-Cola, now those of us that are listening to this podcast now won't be drinking a Coca-Cola unless they put protein and fat in their stomach first. But that being said, one thing that listeners can do today is go to any pharmacy and buy a glucometer, a finger stick glucose machine for $12 to $30. Do a blood sugar when you first get up in the morning. Stick your finger, see what the number is. Write that down. And then eat whatever you want to eat and check your blood sugar again 1 hour after that meal. Set the clock and take it again 2 hours after the meal. If you have pristine insulin and glucose communication and you are not on your way to diabetes, you don't have prediabetes, you don't have insulin resistance, then Dr. DeFranzo and a whole host of researchers that have studied this their entire lives tell us that your body's working well in that department. If 1 hour after eating 75 grams of glucose, and the 75-gram glucose drink is way more than should be in any meal any of us are eating. You could eat all the pancakes and syrup and ice cream and stuff and have a hard time getting 75 grams of glucose. So if after any meal, your blood sugar comes back down to 125 1 hour after the meal and back down to 120 2 hours after the meal, you're probably okay. You're doing pretty good. A continuous glucose monitor gives us more data, more points, throughout the 24/7. That's just one that's what we used to do in the olden days before continuous glucose monitors came out. And it's what we still do for pregnant women that we want to know, are they diabetic? They go drink the glucose drink and check the blood sugar at 1 hour and 2 hours.
I want to say thank you very much for taking the time. And before we kind of wrap this up, I just want to kind of reset why we did this. You talk from what I've gathered, and this may be right, may be wrong, is that our genetics kind of determine our lifespan to a certain extent. How long? Because if we all know that if both parents lived well into their 90s, you have a really, really good shot, assuming lifestyles are similar, to live into your 90s. If they both parents lived to the 60s, same thing. So you have this lifespan, right? Then the reality is, in that we've all talked about it, and when we're sitting down building portfolios with clients and looking at financial plans, they just basically say, I don't want that long, slow trajectory down at the end. That's the health span. That's what this is about prolonging that health span so that you're in there. The wealth span is what our job is to help make sure you have the outcomes to be able to live the lifestyle that you want to live. Most of our podcasts are about how to extend the wealth span. If you were just walking along the street and someone real quickly said, give me your top 3 things that someone needs to do to increase their health span, starting right now, that is not going to mean that they're having to eat kale and all these things that people, well, nothing against kale, I actually like kale, but they're not going to have to eat seaweed or whatever. They can live a life that's fun and everything. What are the 1 or 2 things you're going to tell them to do right starting today going forward?
Yeah, I would tell them to get rid of or markedly reduce the carbohydrates, and your carbohydrates are only in vegetables and fruit. Don't get them from anywhere else. And I would say narrow your window of eating and get plenty of protein, move your body, and have so much fun with that money you're making, or with no money. Have fun and laugh and find your bliss with those you love. All of those things will extend your life and protect you, move you along to protect you from disease.
Well, I just want to say thank you again. I really appreciate you coming. Just for our listeners, this is Dr. Gina Pritchard with the Prevent Clinic. You can find her at thepreventclinic.com. She's right here up in Frisco. Real easy to get to, and absolutely great information. Just want to say thank you very much, and thank you to all of our listeners, and we will see you next week. Have a great week.